Hello, I'm Ted Seides, and this is Investment Management Operations. This show explores the inner workings of the most sophisticated institutions in the industry. Through conversations with executives across operations, compliance, legal, and finance, you'll hear how key operating partners run their businesses in an ever-changing and complex investment landscape. You can join our mailing list and access Capital Allocators content at capitalallocators.com.
I'm Scott McDonald, and I'm your host. This sponsored insight features Neal Pawar, the COO of Enfusion Software, a SaaS-based platform that combines front, middle, and back office in a unified trading system. I was excited to interview Neal to talk about the next generation in order management systems. We cover Neal's time at some of the world's top hedge funds and how it informed his decision to build technology for the industry. We talk about the trade-offs of working for both big and small firms and how decisions on your tech stack changes as your firm grows. We then discuss the evolution of trade order management systems and how the golden copy of data is crucial for building end-to-end collaboration platforms, bringing together portfolio management, operations, and client service. Please enjoy my conversation with Neal Pawar. Neal, it's great to see you. Why don't you take me back to your path and how you got into investment technology?
I studied computer science at Brown. When I graduated, which was back in the early 90s, one of the things I noticed while I was interviewing with companies was that finance was doing a lot more interesting stuff with technology than the tech firms were. And so I ended up joining a company called O'Connor Swiss Bank in Chicago. A number of mergers later, it became UBS. And that's where I started my career. I was building software for market making and risk management in the interest rate derivatives space.
And what drew you to the investment space as a technologist?
At the time, the team I joined supported a team of global market makers and traders across the world who were market making in derivatives. The system that we had built them ran off a single database in Chicago. Now, if you were a trader in Singapore, Hong Kong, London, you had to take the network latency to connect to that system, which back in the 90s was pretty slow. And so one of the problems that we had to solve was we wanted to replicate data across all of our locations so that traders could work with a local instance. Database replication technology didn't exist back then. Sybase, Oracle, they hadn't invented that yet. But we needed to solve the problem. And so we ended up building our own replication technology that many years later, we were able to retire in favor of a commercial product. But the fact that we were solving those types of problems at that point in time, before the big tech companies had solved them, for me was really exciting. It sort of brought the technology to life and ended up starting a career that now, 30 years later, I'm still involved in.
You eventually were acquired by different firms along the way. Can you tell me more about that?
We went through about 4 or 5 mergers in a very short period of time. O'Connor became Swiss Bank. Swiss Bank then joined with Warburg, and then Dillon Reed, and then UBS. I had at least 5 or 6 business cards, each one with a different logo and name along the way. But the core of what I was doing remained the same throughout. The firm just got a lot bigger. So I joined a much smaller trading firm in Chicago. And 6 years later, I was working for one of the largest banks in the world.
Any advice on navigating mergers?
Some of it's luck. When these things happen, sometimes you're on the side of the acquirer. Sometimes you're on the side of the firm being acquired. I was fortunate in those mergers that the side I was on was always the more dominant of the two. And so our technology and our systems just constantly had to bring in more trades from the firms that we were joining with. And so it kept us super busy. It can be challenging. The most important thing that I learned from having gone through a number is that you have to keep an open mind. And there's going to be times when perhaps the firm you're merging with may have a better solution in the space that you're in. Use that as a learning opportunity and grow rather than hold on to a piece of technology because it's been your baby for a while. And so after 6 years in that space on the sell side, I joined a firm called D.E. Shaw. I moved to the buy side, again, where I started out as a technologist. And over the course of my almost 12-year career path there, ultimately became a partner and was one of a few people that ran technology across the firm.
What did technology look like at a firm like that? D. Shaw is very well known today, but back then probably a little smaller.
Definitely smaller. Just in terms of overall size, the firm was probably approximately about $1 billion in assets under management when I joined. By 2008, about 8 years later, it was close to 39, 40 billion. So really massive growth over that period of time. And what was interesting about it was that when a firm grows that rapidly, anybody in operations or technology, you have to deal with this explosion of asset classes, of trading volumes, of geographic locations. And you're faced with a fundamental question, which is, are you going to grow your business by building parallel verticals that will handle the portfolio management, trading, and post-trade world? Or are you going to try and homogenize them onto a single platform? As you can imagine, there are trade-offs. From a time to market perspective, it's often deemed to be a bit quicker to just buy something new, bolt it onto the side, and get the business off the ground. It takes a bit longer to engineer those workflows into existing systems. Fortunately, and some of the mentors that I had at D. Shaw at the time felt very strongly that we should not do bolt-ons over to the side. We took the right amount of time to scale the platforms that we had internally to support new asset classes, to support different flavors and shapes of trading volume. And I learned a ton from just doing that over a decade plus.
Where'd you go from there?
I went back to UBS. After 12 years at D. Shaw, a number of the people that I used to work with at UBS were still there. I was given an opportunity to relocate to Zurich, Switzerland with my wife and children, which at the time, my children were younger. It was a really great opportunity just to go and experience a different part of the world. So I rejoined UBS, but this time in their wealth management division as the CIO for their wealth management business, which at the time was the largest private bank in the world, as they are again today.
There's a theme here with working for smaller firms and larger firms. How do you think about career development and the benefits and trade-offs of those two very different types of institutions?
Sometimes, especially when you're early in your career, you're in your first 5 or 10 years out of college, I view that period as very much an apprenticeship period. You want to find mentors and people around you that you can learn from, and you want to learn as much as you can. And what I found, having joined a much smaller sell-side firm in O'Connor that suddenly 6 years later became this giant firm, UBS, that just from a personal career standpoint, I was moving into middle management. I found myself spending a lot more time in PowerPoint and Excel than I did in a code editor. And I realized that that seemed a bit early in my career to sort of hang up my programming keyboard and move into general management. And so the opportunity to join a much smaller D.E. Shaw kept me very hands-on and nimble. And then as D.E. Shaw grew, obviously I had an opportunity to grow with the firm. I did a similar thing after about 4 years back at UBS. I wanted to move back to the United States. I joined AQR as their CTO. And again, after leaving an organization where I'd been responsible for 3,000 or 4,000 engineers globally, AQR at the time was much smaller. They'd gone through a very big growth phase from 10 billion in assets to 70, 80 billion in assets. And they were dealing with how can they absorb all of that and continue to scale. And the team that I inherited on day one was about 40 people in size. When you go from a very large organization back to a very small organization, it really forces you to both roll your sleeves up and be a player coach. But it's also a great reminder of how much you can get done with relatively few people. And sometimes when you're in larger organizations, there's a lot of overhead to move the needle. When you're in a smaller firm, you realize how much you can get done with relatively less overhead. So it keeps you honest and nimble. And it's something that has definitely shaped who I am today.
When you take all those pieces, so you've got an evolution, you have buy side, sell side, your lens on the world is probably very informed by that. How do you think about that today, given all those pieces? Also, at that point in time, a lot of these trading systems were fairly nascent.
One thing that has really struck me over the years is that when you go back to the 90s and you think about whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, whether it's in portfolio construction or trading or post-trade operations or research, In the 90s, we tended to build almost everything ourselves. There was very little off the shelf that you could buy. And whatever you could buy, if it didn't fit your business, it wasn't that malleable and flexible. We even built systems like HR systems and recruiting systems and CRM systems before the likes of Salesforce existed. And what starts to happen is as those domains start to get more mature, as they get more commoditized, then at a certain point, you find yourself realizing that, say, as a CTO, why should I employ a group of people building a piece of software that I can now buy off the shelf? It's no longer perhaps a strategic advantage to be doing that. And you want to try and migrate those engineers or analysts or whoever to working on things that are going to help continue to differentiate you as a firm. And that's really, for me, always been the essence of the buy versus build argument, is that I like building things that I think will drive an advantage for the firm I'm working for, that will allow us to differentiate our offering versus our competition. But I don't want to build things that I know I can buy off the shelf and get 85, 90, 95% of the functionality out of the box with perhaps a little bit of customization or a little bit of configuration. That's one thing that over my career I have seen change fundamentally. If you fast forward to what I do today at Enfusion, my choice to move away from working for buy-side, sell-side firms as an incumbent to moving on to the other side of the aisle and actually selling software and services into that is the ultimate culmination of that journey, where I realized that I wanted to be building software that can be used by hundreds or thousands of firms rather than building software that is only used by one.
Let's turn to Enfusion. Tell me about what Enfusion is, and then also your roles and responsibilities.
Enfusion is primarily for the buy side, so for asset managers, hedge funds, asset owners. If you're managing portfolios of your own and you have to do portfolio construction, then you need to trade against those. And then post-trade, you want to run risk reports, P&L reports, and accounting. Enfusion is a front-to-back platform that allows you to do all of those things. What underpins all of it is it has a common investment book of record, and it's a shared investment book of record across all of those functions. Now, in a traditional setup, including some of the ones that I've overseen over the course of my career, you often end up having different systems playing different parts of that life cycle. One of the challenges with using different systems is that now you have to keep them mutually consistent. You need to synchronize the data from one to the other. And anytime you're doing data synchronization, you then need to check it with reconciliation and dealing with exceptions and breaks that might come out of that. So the wonderful thing about the Enfusion platform is by having a common IBOR, it means that the entire investment lifecycle process is stored in this consistent database. And a lot of that additional overhead that I just described goes away. The other thing I'll say quickly about Enfusion is that it was designed and built as a software as a service platform from day one. Like any SaaS platform, we push out releases on a regular basis, in our case, weekly. And once we push out a release, every client gets it immediately. When I worked on the buy side and used a lot of the competing products, for example, that we sometimes find ourselves pitching against today, what you'll find is many of them run inside of physical data centers, which means now as a CTO, I have to think about hardware and procurement and securing that hardware and replicating it for disaster recovery purposes and all of that, which is overhead. And then I have to think about upgrades. Every time the vendor pushes out a new upgrade, it's now on me to decide when I'm going to take that upgrade, how I'm going to test that upgrade to make sure that it didn't break anything, and then eventually promote it to production. All of what I said when you work with a SaaS company goes away because you've effectively asked the SaaS company to operate that platform on your behalf. That's a huge difference. And especially as we go into situations where clients are looking to move off of a legacy system that they may have used for a decade or more, it's a real differentiator. My role at Enfusion is I'm the Chief Operating Officer, and essentially that puts me responsible for our revenue organization, our product organization, our engineering organization, and our client service organization.
What was the origin of Enfusion? Where was the genesis of the organization?
A number of the founding members worked at firms like Citadel and other firms in Chicago, and they came together to build an early version of this. And very quickly, it started to gain momentum, particularly popular with hedge fund launches. But over time, as you start to build all that functionality in, it becomes valuable not only for new hedge funds that are looking for sort of front to back in a box, but also for funds and asset managers that already exist who may not be looking for one full front, middle, back solution out of the box, but perhaps their order management system is up for renewal and they want to go to market and look for a new order management system. In those situations, what we find is we will pitch just our OMS or just our PMS against an incumbent one. And if we win that business, it often serves as the beginning of a longer term relationship where once the client has other parts of their ecosystem that may be up for renewal, then clearly the fact that they're already on Enfusion allows them to consider the rest of the product suite that we offer. And it often ends up being a very relatively low lift for the client because once you've got all your data in our IBOR, which you would need to do to be on our portfolio management system anyway, then if you want to start using us for order management, it's the rollout of a new module, but not an entire migration of data onto that platform again. We also run a managed service and think of the managed service as an extension of our clients' operations functions. So some of our clients may not want to run the actual reconciliation processes against their prime brokers or against their administrator. And so they will rely on Enfusion staff who behave as an extension of them to perform those services on their behalf, utilizing our software and our product underneath.
That's interesting. It seems like coming out of the Citadel universe as a multi-strategy organization, there's a benefit because a lot of the incumbents, if you go back even 15, 20 years, started with a singular focus. But then if I go to trade a futures contract, I have to jam it into the system and trick it. But I think it feels like being a little bit newer has some advantages given the proliferation of hedge funds as really a go anywhere strategy. They're now doing illiquids. They're doing credit, they're doing equities, they're doing all kinds of derivatives. It seems like you're well positioned given the landscape change.
You nailed it. I think one of our big selling points is that we are multi-asset class. And so we've had clients who may have started off as a long-short equity shop and then grown into some fixed income strategies. They don't have to go out and find a new system. They can just expand with us. And you make a really good point. I'm sure there's a number of people who'll smile when I say, how many times have you jammed an instrument into an equity? And we know that that's something that we've done all the time. I've worked with other systems in the past where they didn't have the notion of a swap. And so we would fake it. If it was an interest rate swap with a fixed leg and a floating leg, we'd book two bond trades. And then we'd use some user-defined field to tie them together so that some reporting engine knew to actually treat them as a single instrument. The number of times we've done that over the years is incredible. And what's nice about Enfusion being a relatively newer platform and being designed, especially in the early days, for the hedge fund community, the hedge fund community, as you said, trades everything. If you want to be the product of choice for that set of clients, you've got to be able to support every asset class.
You talked about front to back. Maybe tell me more about what you mean by that.
When I say front to back, front starts with the research and the portfolio construction, portfolio management piece. And that's really where a lot of the alpha for these firms is generated. And these are the portfolio managers that either through quantitative or fundamental research techniques are building portfolios. An extension of that moves into trading. And obviously, trading is where you're dealing now with the execution of those portfolios. Every time you make a change in the portfolio, bringing the production portfolio up to the new benchmark that you're trying to bring it to. And we see a variety. Some firms trading is centralized, some firms it's outsourced, some firms it's actually very tightly coupled to the PM. And of course, our platform is flexible enough to support all of them. And then you get into the post-trade world, which often is also referred to as either middle or back office. And there we're talking about accounting, so being able to have an ABOR as well. We have an IBOR and ABOR. We're storing things at the tax lot level, as well as then being able to do performance reporting, attribution reporting, other regulatory reporting. And then there's a critical piece in the middle that I didn't mention, which is compliance. And it's a really important part because what we often see is when a portfolio manager is building their portfolio, they may not be able to trade exactly what they wanted to do because it might breach a position limit or some other rule that prevents them from growing a position beyond a certain size, for example. What tends to happen is a portfolio manager will send their trades into the trading system for execution. The trading system will run the compliance rules and might spit out some exceptions. One of the things that we've been working on is to bring that feedback loop closer so that you don't have to go through this process of submitting the trades and then keeping your fingers crossed that they're all going to make it through compliance. But you should actually be able to determine that upfront and take the necessary action to correct the portfolio before it goes into the trading realm.
You have an in-house rules engine. If I'm a compliance officer and I'm sitting down at the trading desk, I will get a bunch of windows, and some will be soft warnings, some will be a hard warning, and then you can manage that workflow back to the trading desk.
That's exactly right. Actually, one of the features that we've added recently that's been quite popular is now we have a mobile version of our application. And one use case is particularly for compliance officers who aren't always sitting at the desk looking at a screen, but are in meetings and dealing with a lot of other things. They can manage those workflows from their phone or from their tablets as well. And the same is true with portfolio managers. So the fundamental research-based portfolio managers can be traveling around the world, talking to portfolio companies, and then they might want to do a little bit of work on their portfolio in between meetings. And we found the response to having a mobile version of our PMS is huge.
Where does client reporting or IR fit into this equation?
In the post-trade world is where we do all of our reporting, including reports that the manager might ultimately use to bring back to the client. We don't typically run performance attribution ourselves. We work with a number of partners like FactSet or Axioma or others who do that. And one of the nice things about this common investment book of record, once you have that, that's effectively the crown jewels of your clients. What you can start to do is open up services that other third parties may provide. We have a number of different third parties that we work with, one of which is a set of compliance reports. If you want to file a 13F or other things like that, just having all of that taken care of without Enfusion necessarily having to try to be everything to everybody, we can open up that marketplace where we can allow third-party vendors to pitch for our client's business, and then we can do a deep integration of the IBOR to that vendor system so the client doesn't have to deal with all of the extraction, transformation, and loading of data that one typically has to do every time you onboard a new product.
Well, it probably keeps you nimble because you then are aware of evolution, and best in class can change, but you guys are the foundation, and then you need a specialist, then you're aware of here's the best use case. Best in class is a bespoke opportunity.
That's right. In many cases, people don't think about the actual data in the IBOR and how useful it is by itself. And what we've noticed is that clients want access to that data. They don't want to just access it through our tools and our APIs, but they might want to do their own analysis on it. One of the things we've done partnering with Google is we extract out all of the data that sits inside of our IBOR and we put it into a Google BigQuery database. And we make that Google database available to our clients so clients can run all kinds of analysis on it. We've got clients starting to look at LLMs pointing against that data. Now, if you try to point an AI model against your transactional database, you're going to clobber it. It's not going to be able to handle that sort of workload. And so being able to separate that workload out into a database that is designed for the typical scalability and computational needs of, say, a machine learning model or something similar, it really allows our clients to feel like they still have full access and own their data, even though it might, from a transactional basis, sit inside of Enfusion's overall platform.
With that partnership with Google, was that something that Enfusion decided to go forward, or is that client-driven?
A bit of both. One of the nice things about having almost 900 clients is that you're constantly getting feedback loops from clients. As a SaaS product, it means that there's a single instance of our production environment that is serving those clients. And anytime we add a feature for a particular client, all of them get it. When I was running these systems on-premise with annual release cycles, I often found that I would be 1 to 2 versions behind the latest version because, for one, I don't want to be the first one testing their latest release. Let someone else find the bugs. And for two, it's a lot of work to do regression testing of a piece of software. You drop it in, you need to now run a lot of historical tests against it to make sure that the numbers still match, and then you can promote it to production. When you switch to a SaaS business, what you're effectively doing is expecting the SaaS provider to do all that work for you, and that when they push out a release, they need to have rubber stamped that they didn't break anything in any of their client environments. That's something we take incredibly seriously in our QA function. That's their full-time job, is making sure that we have the test coverage and the ability to regression test the features that we push out so that our clients don't experience any issues every Monday when they launch a new version of the platform.
This seems like a great point to turn to trends and themes, and would love your current thoughts on innovation of where we are today.
I recently gave a talk at a conference in New York where I referenced the Gartner hype cycle. The way the hype cycle works is it effectively tracks hype and media hype of any new innovation over time. The reason Gartner has canonized it into this hype cycle is that it turns out that in many cases, new innovations start off in a very similar path. And that path roughly goes like this. The new innovation is launched. We start to see early use cases and excitement about it. And oftentimes, we have a tendency to significantly overestimate the impact of that innovation in the near term. So the hype goes into full frenzy, whether it's things like the internet. If you remember back in the late 90s, before the internet bust, during the internet boom, we were seeing internet companies and ideas and valuations going through the roof, when in reality, the world wasn't ready for pets.com or even Amazon at the time. There weren't enough of us on the internet to generate the kind of revenue that people were expecting. So internet went boom until people realized it wasn't delivering against those promises. And then it went bust, and we saw a massive fallout. And if you go back to the hype cycle, so the initial innovation gets hyped up a lot, then it inevitably fails to live up to the hype, and it falls down into what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment. But slowly it emerges from the trough of disillusionment. Sometimes it doesn't. Some innovations just die and never return. But those that make it out of the trough of disillusionment, now you start to see what the real use cases are. You start to see what the enterprise use cases are. And it starts to go through a much better learning curve of what it's good for and what it's bad for. And eventually it reaches what they call the plateau of productivity, which is where you now see us able to take advantage of that innovation. And if you look at the internet, it followed that story entirely. After the dot-com bust, you start to see companies like Google emerge. You see companies like Facebook emerge. You see Amazon. And in parallel, you see the invention of the smartphone that suddenly puts billions of people online over time, thus enabling the e-commerce and the internet business to become a real thing. And of course, today, it's changed the way we operate. Now, let's jump to something more current. AI, I would argue that the LLM side of AI is currently going through peak hype. In fact, The Economist about maybe 4 weeks ago had an article where they were calling peak hype for AI. What that means is that there's a lot of people out there that are saying the amount of money that's gone into LLMs over the last few years, I think it's estimated at roughly 90 billion in early stage LLM investment just over the last 12 months or so. They're wondering whether companies are going to get as much out as they've put in, given that there's still some pretty significant constraints that we're working through. We're reading articles now about how expensive it is to train models. We're reading articles about how expensive it is to serve up those questions. And we also know that LLMs aren't perfect and they can still make mistakes. As we start to see this LLM hype decline, a lot of what I get asked questions by our clients and others is, well, how should we be positioning ourselves? What should we do about this? And for me, the fundamental answer actually comes back to data. We already know that AI models are nothing without data. The data is the fuel that allows them to learn and to be built. So if you're a financial service firm and you want to get into the area of using LLMs to solve some problem in your business, and you're not sure which one to use and whether now is the time, You might be right, and it might not be the time to go head first into that. However, there's a lot of things you can start to do to prepare for it. So first, where is your data? How do you gather it? How do you collect it? How do you store it? Is it clean? Are there errors in it? Does it have identifiers? Are there ways to uniquely identify it? I would say over the course of the last 30 years, so many of the systems that I've seen built, a big part of what they do is just trying to align apples to apples, because in many cases, we don't have unique identifiers to identify data. So thinking about things like that upfront is super helpful. Where do you store it? If you store it in a relational database like a SQL Server or an Oracle, or do you store it in a column database, or do you store it in a NoSQL database, or do you store it in a blockchain? There's so many variants of databases out there. Which one is the right kind for the type of workloads that you anticipate having to perform on that data is something you want to think about upfront. How you secure it, and not just securing it from a cyber security perspective, which is obviously important, but also from an intellectual property perspective. If you're using a third-party LLM and you're using all of your internal crown jewels to train that LLM, are you confident that that training isn't available to be used by other clients of that model? Are you sure it's only restricted to your use cases? Again, not always the case, something that one needs to look into. We know that data has bias in it. Have you looked for bias? Have you removed it? How accessible is it? How do the LLMs access the data? And do you have the right APIs and access patterns for them to be able to do that? And last, certainly not least, how do you govern it? How do you permission it? Do you have to think about the sovereignty of it? Are you using services that go outside of your geographical location? With GDPR, we're seeing a lot more now about the explainability of AI becoming a topic. There's so many considerations that you need to think about just for your data itself that you can sometimes put off the ultimate decision of which model, because you've got a reasonable amount of work just to get your raw material into a state where it can be used for the purpose that you're thinking about.
When you think about all of those things, does it fundamentally change how your clients will actually hire people over the next 5 years? You've got regulatory compliance people who now have to then monitor the QA, and then you also have a regulatory compliance overview to like whatever comes out of that LLM. You need to make sure that it follows the rules, no different than any quantitative strategy. How does that impact how we hire people?
When you look at an organizational structure of a company or a business, and when you look at the roles that they hire for, they tend to fit fairly nice defined boundaries. You see an organization, it might have portfolio managers, it might have traders, it might have compliance professionals, it might have engineers, analysts, legal, HR, and so on. But what often ends up happening, even before we get to LLMs, just in the world of data, a lot of people don't necessarily recognize that there are many roles that sit on the cusp of all of these things. For example, a very popular role in organizations now is you'll have a team of people that work in business intelligence and reporting. And they might sit in any of the functions that I named, but what they're really doing is trying to connect dots with the data across multiple functions so that they can create a view or a report or an analysis that somebody or a group of people in those functions can use. I think you can see what's happening with LLM evolving in a similar way, is that while on the one hand, there's the fear mongering of LLMs are going to come for our jobs, code is going to be written by AI, and there's some truth to some of those things. I think there are certain areas where LLMs are proving to be quite useful, and code writing is one of them. So that's going to be very interesting. But they're not about to replace all the other parts of a firm. We're not ready for that yet. Maybe that happens at some point in the future. But as we gear up for that, recognizing that there will be teams that will need to be able to explain behavior with quant funds. As we became more quantitative, you saw these offshoots of functions like compliance being created just around these specialist capabilities. I think what we'll see with LLMs is similar to that, to your point about how we hire and the creation of new roles. But I think one thing it universally points to is that no matter what function you're in our industry, as these trends start to become mainstream, understanding how they impact your function and just taking it upon yourself to become more aware of what they are is going to be really important, because otherwise it'll be very easy to get left behind.
In a market that's extremely efficient, if I go and create a sandbox, an LLM, and actually think about the amount of data and information we have today, is there a window today where you might actually have a leg up and maybe a window on alpha generation ahead of others if I move quicker?
Potentially. The thing we have to remember is that machine learning is not new to the quantitative side of our industry, and nor is looking for data where you can extract a signal that gives you an advantage over others. Every quant hedge fund has been doing this. What's changed is that the barrier of entry has gotten a lot lower. 20 years ago, if you wanted to be in the quant space, you needed to be able to build a physical computing infrastructure to run backtests and things like that that might require thousands of Linux nodes in a cluster. And today you can rent that for an hour from AWS for a few $1,000. There's certainly more people that are going to work on those types of strategies, perhaps, than we had 15, 20 years ago. But to the extent that there are new data sources becoming available, when I worked on the buy side, one of the most common sales pitches that I would get would be from so-called alt data providers who would come and say, when the satellite image data sets were getting generated and you can count the number of cars in the Walmart parking lot and try to get an early read on their earnings, these data sets were starting to be sold in abundance, particularly to quantitative firms that knew how to extract the signals for them and use them in portfolio construction. To the extent that there may be signals that haven't been found yet today that can be found with some of the tools that are available, it's potentially true, but I wouldn't make the statement that it's more true now than any point in time, because I think there's been a lot of people thinking deeply about this point more than we're covering right now. I think they've already got a pretty good edge on this space. One other point is blockchain. We talked a bit about the internet, and we know that that's gone through the full cycle. And at this point, it's obviously here to stay. And we've talked a bit about AI that's at a much earlier phase in its cycle. Well, I would argue the blockchain's somewhere in between. It's been around a bit longer. Satoshi Nakamoto or whoever's original paper on Bitcoin in 2011 is now approaching 14, 15 years old. And obviously cryptocurrencies have gone through quite a journey in that time, now to the point where we obviously have seen the launch of ETFs on them. But what I find fascinating about blockchain is the number of topics that have spawned out of it. So smart contracts is a really interesting concept. Tokenization is a really interesting concept. Stable coins, NFTs. Each of these will take on its own smaller hype cycle, if you like. But what seems inevitable to me is that some of these concepts will stand the test of time and will start to make their way into mainstream finance, and some won't. Time will tell. But it's a really interesting period because, just to pick on tokenization, the notion of taking real world assets and representing them digitally and then storing them in some sort of immutable ledger such that you can now have either secondary markets or you can open up new liquidity pools for that asset. That's something that we're in the very early innings of, but we're starting to see a lot of prototypes and ideas coming out of not just startups, but also incumbent exchanges who I think are more and more viewing this technology as something that they need to wrap their heads around in a world where perhaps as things get more decentralized, some of their business models might be at risk.
What's a good use case that we might see coming up in the near term on blockchain?
There's a lot of work that's being done right now around tokenization of funds. When you think about a fund like a hedge fund or a private equity fund, the process that a client goes through in order to invest in that fund involves a lot of subscription documents, paperwork, customer suitability checks, and things like that, and can often take a lot of back and forth. If you're working with an investment advisor, now there's an intermediary that you've got to go through for all of those wet signatures and whatnot. Some of the private equity funds are doing this today, putting their fund into this tokenized structure that now takes a lot of that friction away, but also potentially creates new liquidity pools and the ability for people to trade in and out of those without necessarily the same friction that we've seen historically. Again, very, very early stage, but very promising. And when you see some of the names that are starting to back this, you could really see how it can take off in the next few years.
I would envision the secondary market. So somebody has a hedge fund interest, and we saw this during the GFC, and people were selling it, and they needed to prove that nobody had, it wasn't encumbered. But if you could have something on that platform to validate there's no lien on that asset, that would actually create a little bit of a more efficient market and make that probably cheaper to do and faster.
There was another great use case I saw a few years ago. I think it was AXA Insurance in France. It was an insurance product that's for flight delays. And the way it worked was basically if you buy this insurance and then your flight is delayed by X hours, effectively your insurance policy sat in a distributed ledger. There was a smart contract on that that would look up the time of arrival of your flight. And if it found that your flight arrival time was outside of the SLA and therefore a premium need to be paid, it would automatically effectively do that. And the money would be wired to you within hours of the delay of your flight. What's interesting about that is not so much wiring the money within hours, but rather when you think about an insurance company and the amount of paperwork that would normally take place to process a claim, to get it through the right approval channels, and then to get a check out, and to encode all of that as software, as code, instead of as legal contracts, and in such a way that it's binding and executable. It's a super simple example, but it's a very tangible example that you can start to see how some of these mechanics, when put to work at scale, can really change an industry.
The other thing I want to talk about is data as an asset class. It's something you had hinted at. I'd love to just get your thoughts on what you mean by that.
It's something I stumbled upon while doing a series of lectures at Emory University's business school. The course was to expose the students of the MBA school to frontiers in finance, new asset classes that perhaps one wouldn't normally think about. Could be art, or it could be wine, or it could be data. And as I was doing research for this lecture, I realized that data has a very similar life cycle to some other commodities, like, for example, gold. So if you think about the life cycle of gold, you start off by searching for it, by prospecting it. Eventually, if you find evidence that there may be gold there, then you need to mine it, you need to extract it, you need to clean it, you might need to then tag it, store it, move it, and then you might need to mix it with other metals to create other ores. And then eventually you might give it to a goldsmith who will turn it into perhaps a piece of jewelry. And when you follow that value chain and then you replace gold with data, it almost works identically. If you're searching for signals in data, you're prospecting data. If you find a signal, now you want to build some sort of extractor that brings that data into your environment. Then you might need to clean it. There might be noise in the data. Then you might need to store it somewhere and then start to give it identifiers so that you can then eventually mix and match it with other pieces of data to turn it into something useful. You can build the analogy from there. Obviously, we've been mining precious metals and commodities for a lot longer than we've been mining data. And so you can start to think about, well, what are things that have helped mature the gold industry that we don't have yet in the data industry? And there's a few things that pop out. One of them is standards. There are very clear standards around gold. When we look at data, and especially in the financial service industry, there's a dire lack of standards. In fact, my favorite two data standards that are very successful would be SWIFT for payments and FIX for executions, trade executions. Now, the amazing thing about FIX, for example, is I worked on the buy side. If I wanted to switch my execution venue from one bank to another, it was the easiest thing for me to do. Why? Because all I had to do was point my pipe with the FIX messages to a different broker, and off we go. It is nowhere near that simple to switch your risk system or your OMS or anything else. And one of the primary reasons for that is that the internal data structures that every firm and every vendor uses are different. And so a big part of that switching cost comes due to the lack of standardization and therefore the amount of mapping and reconciliation work that you have to do. Another example that's perhaps a little more forward-thinking with data is recycling. We understand the metal recycling business very well. Metals get recycled all the time. How do we recycle data? Do we recycle data? What does it even mean? But you could imagine I'm a client of Netflix. They have a lot of information about my viewing preferences. They use that to serve me a list of recommendations that hopefully pleases me. But if they were to anonymize my data and aggregate it with other people's data, they could start to sell it as an asset to others. And because it's anonymized, I'm unlikely to object to it being there. It doesn't identify itself to me in any way. But it's the notion of taking data and recycling it by perhaps making certain changes to it structurally or adding anonymity and then creating whole new businesses. One of the punchlines that I use is the one big difference with data as a commodity and any other commodity that we know today is that gold can't generate more gold. Data does generate more data. That creates a whole different set of possibilities. But there was a quote from the World Economic Forum, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, which I like to use, which was that 90% of the world's data is less than 2 years old. It's testimony to how much data is being generated by Internet of Things devices and by all the other monitors and software and technology in use today. If that is true, and if so much of the data that we're collecting is so recent, then when we talk about finding new signals, when we talk about finding ways to monetize data, we know we're still in the relatively early innings and there's so much more to come. And I think that for me is one of the most exciting things about being in this industry, and especially having a technology slant in this industry, is that over the past 30 years, it has not been boring once. There's always some new innovation. Perhaps it's overhyped at the beginning, but when it eventually settles down and we understand how it impacts our world, the impact tends to be long lasting. And having seen a few of those trends already, and we're sitting now on the cusp of perhaps a few more, it's a very exciting time to be working at a company that is providing technology solutions to so many firms in our industry and always trying to think about what's next and how we can best serve our clients.
We still live in a world that's very siloed in how we calculate things, how we compare things. Do you anticipate an iteration or a version where new statistics and calculation methodology will come based on this additional data that's come to market?
I think that's possible. Your point about the silos is incredibly important. We've created silos across our industry, but even within large firms, there tend to be many silos. One of the contributing reasons is this lack of standards. And so when you're sitting on a large amount of data, but it's in a very particular structure, format, and perhaps only internal identifiers, then the number of things you can do with it are limited. To prepare for the world that you just described, where large language models can be unleashed on data to create new products, ideas, concepts, and analyses, they can only do it if the data satisfies certain basic conditions. You could make the argument that you can use LLMs to do some of those things. I don't have identifiers on my data. Let me use an LLM to figure out what the best identifier is. Absolutely. We're starting to see them used in those cases as well. But nevertheless, it's still a means to solving those set of problems about getting your data in order and really taking that seriously as a precursor to those silos falling down and new metrics, new measures starting to come into place. Because without that, what you're really going to end up doing is just hiring more people in those business intelligence teams to try and cobble the data together to get to that outcome. And then the costs that you might incur to provide that outcome might actually outweigh the benefit that you're getting from the outcome.
Well, I'd love to close with two questions. The first question is, what advice would you give to an emerging manager from a technical perspective?
So if you're an emerging manager, startup funds coming out of the gates, the good news is that most of what you need to launch your business is already available, not just through Enfusion, but whether it's infrastructure, whether it's email, whether it's reporting, it's all out there. For one, unless you're going to go into high frequency trading or some esoteric signal generation, you may not need to hire many or any engineers because you can get a lot of that out of the box. So really pay attention to what products are out there. Use your prime brokers and others as partners that can help you identify products and tools that might be appropriate for that. Really focus your time on the things that are going to differentiate you, because the things that are now table stakes in the industry, the buy versus build has moved squarely onto buy, and that commoditization is now reaching a point where unless you're doing something very specific, there's a lot of stuff that you can get out of the box that can get you up and running.
The other question I have is, what piece of information, book, website, anything that you would refer to people to get smarter on this stuff?
There's a book that just got published by MIT. It's called How Humans Judge Machines. And it's written by Professor Cesar Hidalgo. What I learned from reading the book is that humans judge people and machines very differently, even when they're being used to come up with the same outcome. So, for example, let's say you have a machine that is scanning MRIs to find any kind of problem that needs to be looked into. In general, today, we know that actually machines are starting to get better than humans at doing that. However, if the machine makes a mistake, we as humans tend to immediately judge it as a failure and are very quick to write it off or not want to use it again. If a human makes a mistake, we take a lot of other factors into consideration before we jump to that conclusion. If the human didn't mean to make a mistake, but they genuinely were trying to help, but they're human, they made a mistake, we are more likely to forgive them and go back to them. Whereas with the machine, the way we judge them, we are less likely to go back to them, even though statistically the machine might actually be better than humans in the average case at performing that. What that tells us is, as we start to think about the role that LLMs can play in society and in our businesses, it's not sufficient only to be thinking about how do we feed them and the data and other things, but also how will they interact with humans, whether it's our clients or ourselves. Is a robo-advisor and an advisor going to work hand in hand to give their client advice? And if so, what are the biases in humans that we need to be thinking about so that we don't end up not using the machines for something that they're very good for? It's a fascinating read. It's actually a free book, and I highly recommend it.
Neal, thanks for the time, and appreciate all the insights and perspectives on where we are today with technology and trading systems.
It's been a real pleasure, Scott. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard, hop on our website at capitalallocators.com, where you can access past shows, join our mailing list, and sign up for premium content. Have a good one, and see you next time.